It is my pleasure to introduce Kenneth Turan. Kenneth was the film critic of the Los Angeles Times for nearly 30 years and also a film critic for National Public Radio. He's the author of Not to be Missed, 54 Favorites from a Lifetime of Film, among other books. He is a member of the Yiddish Book Center's Board of Directors, a great champion, a great friend, and I have to say truly, Kenneth, it is really wonderful that you wanted to do this book talk here today live. We really appreciate it. Welcome.
Thank you, Lisa. This is not the first time I've been at the Book Center, obviously, but every time I come here, I'm just filled with a renewed sense of wonder at what's been accomplished here and what's going on here. So just want to thank the Yiddish world and this particular part of it for everything you're doing. I'm going to talk, these are my guys, Louis B. Mayer and Irving Thalberg. I picked this photo because they look kind of like gangsters in this picture. You often see them smiling, and here you know that they're really serious, and that's they were definitely very serious. Let me just change my glasses so I can see what I'm saying. And they were people that I'd heard a lot about. Lisa said, I've been a film critic for many years, interested in Hollywood even earlier than that. And these guys are always around. You always read about them. And I just kind of wanted to know who they were. I wanted to know more about them. It was really, the impetus for the book. I wanted to learn about them. And, I learned a lot. To put it up almost in one sentence, they were, and you can almost see it in the picture, they were an unlikely team. But initially, they were soulmates. They were extraordinarily close, and then they fell apart. So the story of the book is in part how they got close, what they did while they were close, and how and why they fell apart. Louis B. Mayer was kind of an archetypical Eastern European immigrant. It's not known exactly where he was born in Europe, what his family name was in Europe. Believe me, a lot of people have looked seriously. I wasn't one of them. That was done by earlier biographers, and no one has really found out. So his family came to the United States, then they went to Canada, and then he ended up coming back to the United States. A lot of the moguls, the early Jewish founders of Hollywood, they came from various trades. Samuel Goldwyn was famously a glove maker. Louis B. Mayer had really, I think, one of the roughest childhoods in terms of immigrant business. He grew up in the junk business. And he, one of the things I found out researching this book that I didn't know, his father would send him out to salvage auctions when he was just, well, I'll read you the sentence. I'll read you the segment. I've got it marked here. Rather than tell it, I will read it. Okay, this is a quote from Irene Mayer Selznick, who was Louis B. Mayer's daughter, married David O. Selznick, who you may know from producing Gone with the Wind, a lot of other major Hollywood movies. And she wrote a memoir of the period, which is, I looked at, I can't even tell you how many memoirs, and hers, I think, was the best. And this is what she said about her father when he was a boy. My father would be sent out to bid at auctions, and he would have the money sewn into the lining of his coat. It never occurred to anyone that this pale, undersized boy was a serious bidder. I think he did very well because the other bidders didn't take him seriously, and he learned about negotiating, when to speak up, and when to make a move, and he learned to make judgments early. And there's a lot of stories in the book about actors and actors' agents trying, having to negotiate with Mayer. And, this is a very tough guy to win. A guy who was bidding when he was a boy, a very tough guy to get the best of in a negotiation, and almost no one did. I think only Greta Garbo did, because Greta Garbo, who worked her entire career for MGM, she really didn't like acting. She was like an early version of Marlon Brando. And she was happy just to stop. It wasn't a bluff. She would say, okay, if you don't do it my way, I'm going back to Sweden. And she meant it. So she would always win in negotiations, but no one else really wanted to stop acting, so Mayer always won. one of the things about Mayer, you can almost see how tough he is in this picture. He made enemies. And there's one anecdote I read, as a journalist, I started doing research and you're not quite sure, have I made the right decision? Is there really a book in this story? What is it going to be like? I came across one particular anecdote, and as soon as I read this anecdote, I said, okay, there's a book here. This is about a man named B.P. Schulberg, who was another early mogul. He was the father of Bud Schulberg, who people may know wrote On the Waterfront, wrote also a wonderful memoir about growing up in Hollywood. And okay, according to the much repeated story, before he died, BP had a request of his son, Bud, quote, "Put my ashes in a box and tell the messenger to bring them to Louis B. Mayer's office with a farewell message from me. Then when the messenger gets to Louis's desk, I want him to open the box and blow the ashes in the bastard's face." So, when I read that story, I said, okay, there's a book here. He was, because he was an Eastern European Jew, Mayer was a Yiddish speaker. He was, grew up speaking Yiddish. And every once in a while, when he got to Hollywood, everyone wanted to become Americanized. You wouldn't know that he was a Yiddish speaker, but every once in a while, something would come out. One of his nephews was a producer, they used to call MGM Mayer's ganz Mishpacha, because he hired a lot of his family, as many of the moguls did. And there was a guy, I couldn't remember his name, his name is in the book, who was a producer on the lot. And whenever Mayer would see him, he'd say, "Hey, how are you doing, Macher?" And, if you know Yiddish, you know what a needling thing that is to say to someone who's your underling, And as soon as I heard that Mayer was calling his nephew Macher, I could just feel so much about him and just how much he pushed people and how much he needled them and how much he was very much in charge. Now, Mayer was also, though it didn't come out very often, Mayer was really traditionally Jewish. He went to services, once a year, as many people did, and still do, I guess. But there's a wonderful anecdote that his grandson related. His grandson, Jeffrey Selznick, witnessed another moment of deep immersion in traditional Judaism. He was asked by his grandfather, by Mayer, in the 1940s to accompany him while he said Kaddish on the anniversary of his mother's death. And Mayer had been devoted his whole life to his mother and really missed her once she died when he was fairly young, and he really missed her his entire life. Selznick reported going in a limo, quote, to the heart of New York's Garment District, where Mayer stopped the car in front of a modest, somewhat dilapidated synagogue that was Middle European in appearance and ambiance. Once inside, Mayer put on a yarmulke and prayer shawl, and for over an hour, with tears streaming down his cheeks, he sobbed and recited Kiddush and other prayers. Afterwards, he had to walk several blocks to compose himself. So this was a side of Mayer that no one in Hollywood ever saw, but he was devoted to his mother, was religious from time to time. He lived in a beachfront house in Malibu, and his father, once Mayer became successful, he brought his father out to live with him. His father really Mayer and his father never got along. His father never liked him, but he felt respect had to be paid. His father sat with the family at every meal, and if people didn't want to be at a meal with Mayer's father, they didn't have to show up. He was very hardcore about the things he believed in. Now, Thalberg was in many ways Mayer's complete opposite. Even though they were both Jewish, they were about as opposite as people could be on the American Jewish spectrum. First of all, Mayer was American born. He was not an immigrant. He was born in Brooklyn, I believe in the Bushwick section of Brooklyn. And his background was German Jewish, not Eastern European Jewish. So let me read you a little about what that came to mean. Though never more than comfortably middle class, the Thalbergs were German Jews like their wealthy compatriots, the Warburgs, the Lehmans, and the Schiffs. German Jews did not speak Yiddish, had gotten to America earlier than Eastern Europeans like the Mayers, had assimilated faster and become successful sooner, and in general looked down from the heights of supposed gentility on their ne'er-do-well co-religionists. This is what Irving Howe in World of His Fathers said: The tensions between the established German Jews and the insecure Eastern European Jews had become severe, even rather nasty. The Jewish Messenger, a German Jewish weekly, called the newcomers, quote, slovenly in dress, loud in manners, and vulgar in discourse. So, these are Jews talking about other Jews. These kinds of nettlesome ethnic and class divisions were hardwired into the DNA of Jews of the period. And though it is unlikely Thalberg and Mayer ever spoke about them to each other, it's hard to imagine both were not aware of the gap and that their ultimate conflicts weren't affected by them. I think they both got a kick out of the fact that they got on with each other, but they were really, as I said, at the opposite ends of the Jewish spectrum. And that worked, and until it stopped working. Thalberg also had a gift, which everyone saw, and no one could explain. It's a gift he had young. It's not that he got it through experience. He was out in California running Universal Studios when he was 19. And the line was that he ran the studio before he was old enough to sign the checks. And Ben Hecht, who was, a great wit and a great writer, his partner, Charles MacArthur, they wrote the front page together. Charles MacArthur was a close friend of Thalberg, so Hecht got to observe Thalberg a lot. And I've got a quote from Hecht here that I really like. Okay. Ben Hecht saw him, quote, as a genius who hadn't the faintest idea of what was going on anywhere in the world except his office. He lived 2/3 of the time in the projection room. He saw only movies. He never saw life, but he knew what shadows could do. Again, no one could understand why Thalberg was as good as he was at what he was good at. But he was. I mean, one of the, standard situations in Hollywood, even until today, is that creative people, writers and directors, they dread getting notes from studio executives. So what people flee from, it's one of the, things people have to put up with to make the large salaries people make. People liked Thalberg's notes. Thalberg said things that creative people found helpful. I mean, the only way I think that I can think of where this came from, he always was, he was born what they called a blue baby. He was never expected to live very long, and in fact did die when he was 37. But he spent a lot of his childhood bedridden, and he read classic novels. He read all of Dickens. He read stuff like that. He read The Three Musketeers. And my own personal feeling is that somehow story structure and things like that, he just imbibed it, and he was able to do things like that. There's a story that I really like about the last film that he, as I said, maybe I didn't say all of Greta Garbo's films were from MGM. And the last film of hers that Thalberg oversaw was Camille, which you may or may not know. It's a classic romance, kind of a forbidden romance. And there's a scene where the two lovers who are having a lot of trouble, they decide finally they're gonna run off together, and they're gonna be happy. And I won't tell you what happens, but they're planning, their romantic escape. And Thalberg told George Cukor, who was the director, he said, have the actors play the scene like they're planning a crime. And if you watch the film again, you can see that, in fact, Cukor passed that direction on, because they really do talk about it that way. And it gives a kind of urgency to the scene. Again, this is a kind of thing, one of the many kinds of things that Thalberg could do. He just knew how to improve things so that audiences would react better. He didn't, and this was just a gift he had. One of the things I was able to do was, this was a tough book to research because I researched it during COVID. And the archives were closed. Some of the places, even the archivists weren't allowed in. But I found people to help me. A friend of mine told me, call the USC archives, and there's a man named Ned Comstock, who, if you read the acknowledgments to a lot of Hollywood books, people thank everyone, and then they say, and a special thanks to Ned Comstock. Ned Comstock was one of these archivists that went above and beyond what anyone else would do. I call him up and he says, I think it's a great book. I'd love to help you. I called him on a Tuesday. He said, Friday's my last day here. I'm retiring. I said, oh my God. But he says, no, no, don't worry. I'll be able to do some things. And he emailed me extraordinary things. I mean, that's why people loved him. When he died, people really were shocked. And he emailed me things. Thalberg was famous, for his, as you can imagine from what I've said, for his story conferences, when he would talk to, the writer and the director, and they'd hash over both the script before it was filmed, and they'd hash over scenes after they were filmed. And I didn't really know this, but Thalberg, Ned Comstock tells me, he said, Thalberg hired a stenographer, and there's several of these. I have the transcripts of many of his story conferences. And he emailed me these transcripts, and they were, other people had seen them. I wasn't the first person to see them, but I'm a former journalist. I have a good ear for quotes, and I saw things in these story conferences that other people hadn't written about. And I wanted to read you a little bit of the one for Grand Hotel, which was one of their bigger pictures, MGM's biggest picture, one of MGM's biggest pictures. And so there were many hours in story conferences. Like one of the things that I got a kick out of was, in Grand Hotel, there's a moment where one of the characters plays chemin de fer, which is a card game, which I don't know much about. But Thalberg says, I've played a lot of chemin de fer. He had several ideas as to how the card game should be portrayed in the film, including the tart observation that, quote, it's one game you can't play with friends. So. But, he just talked about, again, this is what I wrote. It's clear that Thalberg lived for the ins and outs of sentence structure and story construction. More than just story, Thalberg believed in the audience as the ultimate arbiter of what was before it. Quote, nothing in the world could make me do that, he begins one response, ending it, quote, unless I saw it on the screen and was convinced. He just felt, and this is an interesting paragraph. Given that he was the executive in charge of production, Thalberg was supposed to care about how much money was being spent by the studio. So it's a bit of a surprise to see him make the point again and again that as long as the film was a go, it should try to be the best no matter what the cost. Quote, if you could get things over by a lot of extras walking out with golf bags, pictures would cost about $25,000 a piece, he says, adding, quote, I don't think there is any argument. If it's good, it's good. If it isn't, it isn't. The way to save a lot of money is not to make it. So, once he was in, he was all in, and he just wanted films to be as good as they could be. Not only to make money, he was obviously interested in the films making money. He really believed in the audience. He really wanted to keep faith with the audience. He felt it was kind of a betrayal of the audience if you didn't give them the best film that you could make. That's one of the things that united him and Mayer. He was kind of a zealot. They were both zealots for the movies. They believed in the movies. They felt they could improve society. They were very much, and this was a time when a lot of people still mocked the movies, felt that they were just carnivals. The fact that, today we take it for granted that film is an art. But when they were starting, this was not the case. So they really believed in that, and that's what they tried to do. Okay. He was, as I said, in so many ways, he was the opposite of Mayer. He was more American in his Jewish observance. He went to the Wilshire Boulevard Temple. There was a rabbi there named Edgar Magnin, who was the original rabbi to the stars, and, believed, felt that, he just was the opposite of an Eastern European rabbi. And he built this huge temple, which is still there. If anyone has been to Los Angeles, or you've probably been to anyone been to the Wilshire Boulevard Temple? Okay, Larry. So, it's still there. It's quite a building. And I want to read you something about how it was put together and Thalberg's part in that. Okay. When Magnin decided he needed a bigger stage, he built the massive 1929 temple inspired by Rome's Pantheon. Hollywood studio heads lined up to lend a hand. While the major moguls made appropriately substantial gifts, the three Warner Brothers funded studio artist Hugo Balin's creation of the sanctuary's wraparound murals. Carl Laemmle paid for 8 Spicebox-inspired bronze chandeliers, and Mayer donated 2 massive stained glass windows. Thalberg's contribution was made with his usual perspicacity. He chose to pay for the painting of the Shema, Judaism's foundational prayer, in gigantic gold leaf Hebrew lettering surrounding the oculus, which is the central opening in the sanctuary dome 110 feet off the ground. Visible but not overpowering, significant but not ostentatious. It was exactly right for Thalberg. That was kind of the way he approached things. Just a couple of more points I want to make. Number one, and one of the things that surprised me, even though it probably shouldn't have, both Mayer and Thalberg faced, anti-Semitism was surprisingly prevalent in public in ways that probably shouldn't have surprised me, but did surprise me. The one example I wanted to talk about, in the 1920s, for instance, the Saturday Evening Post, the largest circulation weekly in the country, published a series of short stories about an aspiring young studio executive named Isidore Izzy Iskovich, a character whose relationship to Thalberg was clear even before, anything else was written about him. Driven by craven love of money and the desire to be, quote, a future motion picture magnate before whom all others should pale, Iskovich, quote, with curly hair and dark brown eyes and olive skin of his race, close quote, spoke in a kind of semi-literate cliches. He said things like, I got a job like there ain't any on any other lot. And, Thalberg was an extremely cultured guy. He played Chemin de Fer a lot. This was not who he was, but this was the anti-Semitic caricature that, again, this was not on some pamphlet. This was in the Saturday Evening Post. There was probably half a dozen at least stories about this character. And this is the kind of stuff that I think Mayer as well as Thalberg had to deal with. And it was just a part of the price to pay to be Jewish in America. I mean, I think they just shrugged it off. I didn't get any sense that they agonized over it. I'm sure they noticed it and were troubled by it. But this was just business as usual. Let's see. When they were together, during the heyday of their relationship, Thalberg and Mayer they made MGM the #1 studio. This was Hollywood's golden age, and MGM was the #1 studio. It was the only studio. Their logo was Leo the Lion. There were a lot of reports that people would applaud the logo. They'd be in the theater and they'd see the MGM Lion, and people would applaud because MGM films for the time were quality. Now, the kind of films they are haven't necessarily, what the 1930s idea of quality hasn't necessarily meshed with today's idea of quality. I had lunch with a critic in New York a couple of days ago, and he said, I'm interested in your book, but I really don't care for MGM films. The films that critics today care about are the Warner Brothers films, which were socially conscious films, gangster films, the Paramount films, which had a lot of emigre directors and were more sophisticated. But at the time, MGM was #1. It was the only studio that made money every year of the Depression. Every other studio had losses on one or more years, not MGM. So I want to end with this quote from the book. Working the levers together, they could do no wrong, until, to borrow Ernest Hemingway's phrase, gradually, then suddenly they fell apart. A rapture that was an open secret in Hollywood even before Thalberg's death. If, speaking of the partnership's beginning, Mayer's perceptive daughter, Irene Mayer-Selznick, could poignantly say, my father never loved anyone the way he loved Irving, there were also reports that in the immediate aftermath of Thalberg's death, Mayer gloated to a confidant, isn't God good to me? What began in bliss ended in something bordering on rancor. So, I found this to be a fascinating story. This is the story I tell in the book. And, I'm happy to answer Lisa's questions and your questions and the questions of people further away than the seats in front of us. So thank you.
First, thank you. Thank you for the talk. Thank you for the book. And full disclosure, one of the many wonderful privileges of my job is I get to ask you a question that I want while I hold off on questions from the audience. So before we get started, a question I've never actually asked you is, how did you find your way to become a film critic?
I used to answer that by saying bad career advice. But, depends how long, I loved movies as a kid. I grew up in New York. I didn't go to the theater that often because my father was strictly observant and there was no going to the movies on Shabbos, you know. But I watched all week in New York a program called $1 Million Movie, which a lot of people remember. They showed, they had, you know, public domain Hollywood movies were shown multiple times during a given week. And I saw a lot of great films on $1 Million Movie. But, you know, when I was a kid, I didn't know what a film critic was. The film culture didn't exist to the extent it does now. I am always meeting, you know, 12-year-old film critics who have a whole long list of films they've reviewed. This wasn't what was going on when I was a kid. So I love film, and I thought, well, this is just going to be something else. And when I went to graduate school in journalism, because I love film, I took a course with a woman named Judith Crist, who was at Columbia Journalism School. She was one of the top film critics in New York at the time. And I enjoyed writing reviews, the first reviews I'd ever written. And she told me once, she said, you know, you could do this. You know, you could do this. You could become a critic. And, you know, she was a very forceful person. And I like to say, when Judith Crist tells you something, you listen. So, but it took me years and years and years. You know, these are the jobs, like the job I had at the LA Times. There are not a lot of them. And by the time I got offered the job, I said no. I said, I don't want to do this. I used to want to do this, but I'm past it. And the editor who offered me the job said, well, think it over, you know? And I went home, I thought it over, and I said, well, I'll try it for a few years. And I said yes, and I ended up 30 years doing it. So shows how little you know, even what you think you know. So that's the answer.
Okay, it's actually working now. Good, good, good. So the book is part of the Yale series on Jewish lives. And the question I have for you is, why Meyer and Thalberg? Why do it about the two?
So, yeah, I mean, I love that series, Jewish Lives. I assume people are familiar with it. They're very interesting books, and they have always very good writers doing them. And it was, I said to my agent, you know, it would be nice. I'd like to have a book in the Jewish Lives series. And she knew the editor, and she talked to the editor, and he said he was interested. And it was a back and forth. I mean, I suggested Kirk Douglas, and they were not interested in Kirk Douglas, and they counter suggested Louis B. Mayer. And I'd always been interested in the Mayer-Thalberg interaction into, you know, they're like one of the great teams, especially in terms of executives. They're the most famous, most successful team in Hollywood history. So I said, what about Mayer and Thalberg? And they said yes, and that's how it happened.
I love how you start the book by introducing each of them in terms of some biography. And what jumped out, which you addressed in your talk, was the idea that, you know, they both come from very different Jewish backgrounds. And yet both of them had very strong relationships with their mothers. Can you speak a little bit about that in terms of how that partnership worked?
You know, I'm guessing that that was kind of a below the surface kinship that they had, that, you know, that they really saw in each other. I mean, Mayer, as I said, you know, was very devoted to his mother. And, you know, there are stories that he kept this picture in his office over his bed for the rest of his life. You know, he made a lot of movies about mothers. There are stories that he punched several people who, you know, made disparaging comments about mothers. I mean, he was just hardcore. It's appropriate we're doing this on Mother's Day, because he was a hardcore lover of his mother. And Thalberg's mother was also the dominant person in their family. She was very strong-minded. She was very worried about Thalberg's, you know, as I said, he was born a blue baby. No one knew how long he'd live. And she appointed herself the person that would, you know, look after his health, make sure that he stayed alive as long as possible. And she kept this position his entire life. I mean, there's stories that she really didn't want him to get married because she thought the stresses of marriage and a family might kill him. And she kept people, you know, women away from him. And she really tried to run his life to that extent. Norma Shearer, who the actress who was one of MGM's stars, who he did marry, I mean, she had a mount kind of a really concerted campaign to convince Mrs. Thalberg that she wasn't going to kill Irving, you know, that she had Irving's health as much in mind as his mother did. So you're right. They both had mothers that were major factors in their lives.
And I did mean to point out, for those who thought it was odd to do this on Mother's Day, there was a method to our madness. And one other sort of related fact, and then we'll get into a few other things. Being somebody in Massachusetts, I was fascinated that Mayer's roots go back to Haverhill, Mass, and the
Yes.
first acquisition.
Yes, I mean, yeah, I mean, I think it's just random that he ended up, he came down, he was in Nova Scotia. He wanted to come to the United States and he ended up coming to the Boston area. And I can't remember, there may not have been a reason. It may just have been the biggest American city close to Newfoundland.
But he buys the theater. That
Yes, he
was
buys a theater.
wild.
Yeah, it was a theater, a rundown theater that was, well, he was always looking, all these guys like kind of invented the movie business on the fly. He started out kind of distributing films that other people made. And then he saw that there was money in owning a theater. So he said, well, I'll own a theater too, and I'll show the movies I distribute. And so he bought this, what was a theater called The Gem initially, but it was so run down that everyone says people called it The Germ. And he rehabbed it and he put a big oil, I think at some point he put a big oil painting of himself in the lobby. And, then eventually he decided, well, better than distributing films, better than exhibiting films, I should be making films. So he brought his family out to Hollywood and he started Louis B. Mayer Productions, and he kind of, started to make films and made himself really, by all reports, a pest on movie sets because he was trying to figure out how movies were made, and he was always hanging out and looking. And in those days, the director, much more than probably any time since, the director was really king. Studio people, even though they provided the money, they were considered to be kind of lesser forms of cinematic life. So people didn't want him around, poking his head around corners. And but he was determined to learn, and learn he did.
I'm going to ask you two more and then open it up to the many questions we have coming. One question is, how do you think they left a legacy in Hollywood?
That's an interesting question, because really in this day and age, the studio system is not in great shape. This is not a golden age of the studio system, but the studio system has lasted about 100 years. A lot of great films came out of it, and really they were some of the people who helped create the studio system, and they made a lot of films that people still love and still watch. And the studio system may yet survive in some form. I mean, people have been counting the movies out for a long time. When sound came in, when radio came in, when television came in, everyone said, this is going to be the end of the movies. And well, so far, no. So I'm hoping that the movies find a way to succeed, even though the studio system is very different now, and there's much more kind of consideration. Even, in Thalberg's day, the studio basically owned the talent. I mean, one of the things Thalberg did when he remade films. He would screen them, test them, walk around the theater and see how people were reacting. And then he'd come back and have a list of scenes he wanted rewritten. And the scenes would be rewritten because the writers were sitting, on the lot. The actors were on the lot. If he needed something reshot, they were called off of whatever they were doing. If the director who'd made the original film was busy, another director would direct the new scenes. So they remade these films until audiences were happy with them. And, that's, in some ways, that's something that I think, I read a quote from Sidney Lumet talking about, who was a much more recent director. And he said, he was talking about a film he had made, and he said, what I really needed was the old Irving Thalberg system, where you could really remake films and make them better. And I don't know, I wish there was a way to combine that with giving actors and writers more freedom.
I found that fascinating because it's not like they were removed in some office looking at just the financial aspect of it, but to understand their audience and to really be able to change that collaboration was interesting. My last question for you is, the book you ended up writing, is it the story that you imagined when you set out on this?
It's a story true to that anecdote, that I read about blowing the ashes in Louis B. Mayer's face. I just wanted to, as a journalist, your job is always to tell an interesting story, to tell a true story, but to make it interesting, to make people want to know it, to make people enjoy it while they're reading it. And yeah, I mean, I think I learned a lot of stuff that I didn't know, which is, if you don't learn stuff while you're writing a book, you're probably not doing it right. But, I was happy to be true to that anecdote. And also, I wanted these people to be people. I mean, there's been a lot of big, thick biographies of Thalberg and Mayer as individuals. And, there's like 5 each. And in all the Mayer books, Thalberg is important, but the biographer says, well, Mayer was the key guy. And in the Thalberg biographies, Mayer is important, but the biographer says, well, Thalberg was the key guy. And I wanted to have a balance. I wanted them both to be the key guys, and I wanted to see them as people. They did things that were amazing, but everything they did was not admirable. People loved them and people didn't like them. Even Mayer, who's usually considered to be kind of overbearing, actors loved Mayer. Mayer was very histrionic. One of the lines was that, Mayer was the best actor on the MGM lot was Louis B. Mayer. He was really a performer. So people liked both of them. People didn't like both of them. So that's what I wanted to keep the focus on, and hopefully I did.
So first question from those online. Did they engage with anti-Semitism in the films in any way, directly or indirectly?
Not that I could see any sense of. As I said, they were very much aware of it. After Thalberg died, when Mayer ran things alone, I mean, MGM was one of the studios that Mayer lived for the studio. It was the most important thing in his life. And everything he did was with what he thought was for the best interest of the studio in mind. Even when the blacklist started, initially Mayer said, I'm not going to, my writers aren't communists. I wouldn't allow it. And he said he wouldn't let anyone force him to get rid of his writers, but he bent eventually. But initially his impetus was to protect the studio. And the same thing happened at the dawn of World War II. MGM had a lot of money invested in Germany. They had theaters in Germany, and some studios pulled their product out of Germany when the Nazis started terrorizing the Jews. And Mayer did not. I mean, he was aware of what was happening, but again, the health of MGM was what mattered to him. He didn't want to lose money, so he was one of the last studios. MGM was one of the last studios to close its German offices. So he was aware of it, but other things were more important to him.
I'm also going to open it up to those of you in the audience. If you have questions, go back and forth. Yep. And hang on while Elizabeth brings you the mic. I'm going to ask you a question in the meantime from our virtual audience.
Can you turn this on? Thank you.
Did Irving face criticism for favoring the wife over actresses?
Yes, well, as I said, he was married to Norma Shearer. She was one of MGM's top actresses. The only criticism he got about that, because she was a very popular actress, audiences liked her, he got a lot of criticism from Joan Crawford. Joan Crawford was also a star at MGM. She and Norma Shearer often competed for the same parts. And, Norma Shearer often won and Joan Crawford often lost. And there's a famous quote. I actually found the journalist's notes about where it was said and exactly what the wording was. But Joan Crawford famously said, I can't win against Norma Shearer. She sleeps with the boss, And she was really irked for, I think, her entire time at MGM until Shearer retired, that she felt Shearer was getting the pick of the roles that she wanted. She became a big star anyway, but she wanted more.
I was going to ask you what your favorite MGM films are, and if your taste or appreciation of the movies changed as you were working on the book, that you got some insight into something that maybe you didn't appreciate quite before.
It was interesting to see. I mean, they actually, it comes in 2 parts. I mean, I got more appreciation of some films when I read how they were made. There's a famous film called The Sin of Madeleine Claudon. It's not a famous film in terms of anyone having seen it. Even film critics often haven't seen it, including me. I didn't see it till I was researching the book. But this was a film that was considered so bad that the MGM put it on the shelf. They said it's unreleasable. Thalberg had been in Europe when this decision was made. He went to spas every couple of years because of his heart condition. And he came back and he said, what happened? Where's this film? And they said, oh, it's terrible. We put it on the shelf. And he said, let me see it. And he looked at it and he said, I know how to fix it. And it turned out he did. There was a number of changes he made. And the film got released and it won an Oscar for Helen Hayes for Best Actress, So that film was fascinating. I got a new appreciation of it, but I didn't really it's not a great film. The films that I really liked, I think Camille is one of my favorite that I mentioned before, the Garbo film that was Thalberg's last. It's always fun to see. There's also a silent film that was an MGM film that I really love called Show People. It's a comedy with Marion Davies, who's often no one really, Marion Davies is the actor who was slandered by Citizen Kane because she was William Hearst's girlfriend, and everyone thought that the terrible opera singer in Citizen Kane, who was Kane's girlfriend, that was Marion Davies, and Marion Davies must have been a terrible actress. She wasn't. She was a wonderful comedian. She was very funny. Everyone knew this but Hearst, who didn't like her in comedies, which is why she didn't make most of them. But Show People is an inside Hollywood movie that I got a kick out of. There's also an inside Hollywood sound film that I really like called Bombshell, starring Jean Harlow as like a version of herself combined with a version of Clara Bow. So, it was fun to see these things knowing more, but, they didn't really necessarily change that much.
Oh, yeah. I've got too many questions and it's not enough time, but I'll try to put, there's one main question I want you to answer, but you can hear me, right?
It's also
Okay.
for the audience,
Oh,
virtual audience,
okay.
so.
It's just such a small space and it feels weird to talk into this thing. But anyway, I had always wondered how it was that there were so many Jewish people in the world of Hollywood, besides Mayer and Thalberg, because, well, I didn't quite understand how that came to be. And a lot of Jewish immigrants were in New York City, and that's in the other 3,000 miles away from Hollywood. If New York had been the center of the film world, that would have made a little more sense to me. And you gave the brief story of how Mayer came from Nova Scotia to Haverhill to Hollywood. That was interesting. But I don't know how everybody else kind of did that. But Thalberg, when you said he was so powerful at the age of 19, that is really hard to understand, because I think of that world, or any world, in any kind of business, as being hard to penetrate. So many gatekeepers. And to be that young, to have somehow, I've heard these stories about the person who starts in the mailroom and then goes up somehow because of their brilliance or personality or who knows what. But I just don't see how that could have been possible at such a young age to be at that high a position. How could that have happened? Just seems.
It was, I'll answer that part first. It was unusual even then, but everything is site specific. There are several things that happen. Well, first of all, maybe I'll answer the first part first. The movie business started on the East Coast. New Jersey, especially the Palisades, there were movie studios there, and the movie business really started like in the early parts of the 20th century. It started on the East Coast. What happened was that the movie camera was patented by Thomas Edison, and he formed a trust called the Patents Trust, and he prosecuted people who used his technology. And people went to California, movie companies went to California, because the weather was nice. People went out there and reported back that it's sunny all the time, it's easy to film out here, but also to escape Edison's grasp. It was 3,000 miles away at a time when 3,000 miles meant something. And they went out here to escape prosecution for violating Edison's patent by using a motion picture camera. And eventually that got settled and it became less of a threat. But that was the cause of the original migration to California. And Thalberg was everything about Thalberg was unusual. His mother was a friend of the wife of Carl Laemmle. Carl Laemmle was, again, one of these original immigrants who founded a studio. He founded Universal. And there are varying stories about how the two met. Yeah. So he met Carl Laemmle, who ran Universal. Carl Laemmle used to show movies on the weekend at this vacation house where Thalberg's mother had a house too. They were neighbors. So he was impressed by Thalberg as this kid who was, had cogent comments on the movies that he saw. And he hired him as his secretary. He didn't hire him to run the studio. He hired him as his secretary. And then one thing leads to another, and he's going on a trip to California, taking the train to California. And he tells Thalberg, why don't you come out with me? So his mother didn't want him to go because, as I said, his mother was worried that, but he went. And, then he's proved good at, he gave Laemmle good advice. And Laemmle said, why don't you stay out here? I'm going back to New York. Why don't you stay out here for a while? And gradually he got to know the business well enough, even though Laemmle's studio was famous because even more than Mayer, he hired a huge number of his relatives. And they all had kind of nebulous positions at the studio. And it made it difficult to get anything rational done because all these relatives had their own personal interests in mind. But finally, Thalberg was out there long enough, a year or so, where he figured it out. And Laemmle was unhappy with the way things were going, and he put Thalberg in charge. And that's how it happened. And he left partly because all those Laemmle relatives continued to make his life difficult. And he just wanted to leave and be on his own more. And Mayer needed someone who knew about story to help him in his own studio. So they met for dinner and they kind of fell in love with each other. And that's how that happened. But all of it is specific. It's not like a lot of this was going on. There's no story quite like Thalberg's.
I also have to say, as a reader, and I encourage you all to get the book, the way that you tell some of these stories and just how it's sort of like one thing happens to lead to another thing, and there you have this amazing partnership. I'm going to do one from our virtual audience. Any thoughts on the portrait of Thalberg in Fitzgerald's The Last Tycoon?
Yeah, that's one of the things that interested me about Thalberg was the way that Fitzgerald, I think it's inevitable that in some ways it's hard to see the reality of Thalberg because the picture that Fitzgerald paints of him in The Last Tycoon is almost more powerful in our culture than the reality. More people have read The Last Tycoon than have done research into Thalberg. So Fitzgerald's portrait is very important. It probably had some impact on what we think about Thalberg. But, I think Raymond Chandler, one of the things that's great about The Last Tycoon is its portrait of the film industry. It's very accurate in how the business works. And again, it's an unfinished novel. There are all kinds of reports about, what Fitzgerald would have done. There's some of his ideas sound terrible today. He had some kind of gangster plot he was going to bring in that he never wrote. But what we see is fascinating. And, Raymond Chandler, who was very acerbic, and had his own experience in the film business, wrote Double Indemnity with Billy Wilder. He said that he loved the portrait of the movie. He said that this is the best portrait of the movie, the way the movie business works, the way Hollywood works that we have in fiction. But he hated the Last Tycoon's romantic story. He said, when he's not working in the movies, he said Monroe Star is just, another lonely guy with too much time on his hands, So he didn't care for the romantic plot at all. But even Chandler, who could, as I say, be very acerbic, he was very taken by how accurate. Of course, Fitzgerald worked for years and years. He worked with Thalberg. He didn't particularly like Thalberg. When he died, he wrote in his journal, that, Thalberg was no friend to me, but I'm going to miss him. He was a larger-than-life character, and Fitzgerald, as a writer, appreciated what Thalberg was like, even though he was bad for Fitzgerald's career. Fitzgerald was apparently not a very good screenwriter, even though he was a brilliant novelist, and he just didn't do well in Hollywood.
I'm going to just follow that with this question, which is there a signature way that Thalberg made films?
Carefully.
Successfully?
Yeah, he paid attention to the details. You know, he knew what he wanted. Again, it was a gift that he knew what was going to work, and he kept at people until he got it. You know, and that was a. You know, people often think they know what's going to work. He's like one of the few people who actually did know what was going to work, and you know that made him singular.
Let's see if we've got one other person. No. Okay, then you get 2 questions. Hang on just a second while we bring you the microphone.
It's for the people on
For the
Zoom.
people on Zoom. We have hundreds of people on Zoom who want to hear.
Enormous hordes, biblical hordes.
So, and this is not a specific Mayor Thalberg question, but one of the more negative sides of Hollywood has been, which came to light more in the Me Too movement, is the casting couch scenario, which is pretty famous. And I always felt bad about it because of the association between Jews and Hollywood. And I don't know how much you know about whether how much either of these 2 superstar men had to do with that, or who else had to, how that sort of got to be what it got to be. But is there anything you can say about that in terms of that aspect of it?
For sure, it existed, but you know, everyone didn't do it. Thalberg for sure.
Directors then.
No, studio executives too, but it was just it's individual cases. It's not everyone. Thalberg for sure did not. You know, there's no 000 reports of him, you know, doing anything like that. The report on Mayer is more mixed, and it's almost more than, you know, I don't have the energy to get into it now, but I mean, he didn't really. Anyway, it's more mixed with him. But, you know, definitely, I mean, the non-Jewish executives, it is not a Jewish thing for sure. There were a lot of non-Jewish executives in Hollywood, and they were just as guilty as the Jews who were guilty.
We'll make this our last question. And if you'll wait for the mic, thank you. Can you, can you just give me the book for a second while we're waiting?
Forgot I even had it.
And just again, for those in the audience, this is the book, Louis B. Mayer and Irving Thalberg, The Whole Equation by Kenneth Turan. It's available out front for those of you here. It can be signed, or at shop.yiddishbookcenter.org. Okay, ready.
Ken, do you have any observations about the relationship between Mayer and Thalberg and the G of MGM?
Sam Goldwyn.
Sam Goldwyn.
Well, Mayer, you know, as I said, Mayer, a lot of enemies of Mayer's, and Mayer and Goldwyn were enemies. I think Mayer criticized one of Goldwyn's marriages. I mean, these guys did things to each other that were just kind of way beyond the pale. But towards the end of, you know, at the very end, when Mayer's and Thalberg's relationship was really bad, and Thalberg was in the process of leaving the studio, Goldwyn kind of swallowed his pride and went to see Mayer on the MGM lot to try and convince him that, you know, that he should not let Thalberg leave and that he should repair the relationship. So, because Goldwyn was very close to Thalberg, there's a letter in the Academy archives, Thalberg's handwritten response to both Goldwyn and Lillian, I think it's Lillian Gish, wanted to bankroll Thalberg in a new company. And he sent them a letter saying, that's very generous of you, but the timing isn't right, and I'm not going to do it right now. So Goldwyn was very much a Thalberg partisan, to the point where he swallowed his pride, went on the lot, and asked Mayer to treat Thalberg better.
But eventually, Mayer pushed Goldwyn out, and Goldwyn had to sue Mayer to try to get the right to use his own name in business again. It's a landmark trademark case.
Yeah, I don't know if he sued Mayer or he sued Lowe's. You know, I don't think at that early stage, Mayer was not that powerful in the studio. That was relatively early on in the career, and I think he probably sued Nick Skank, you know, and the Lowe's company, who were probably responsible for that. It's my sort of memory, but I wouldn't swear to it. I know that happened, but I don't know that Mayer was the prime mover.
Kenneth, thank you so much for the book and for journeying here, for all you do for the Yiddish Book Center. And it's a reminder that I think it's time for us to do the Kenneth Turan recommended film screenings at the Yiddish Book Center.
Well, it's always a pleasure. It's a deep, deep pleasure to be at the
Right.
Book Center and to talk to you, Lisa. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you all for joining us. And again, you can join Kenneth up front in the lobby receiving area where the book is available. For those online, thank you so much for joining us. Please check out our events calendar, and we'll see you again hopefully on June 8th for Aaron Lansky's Melinda Rosenblatt lecture, June 8th. Learn all about that and all the other upcoming events at yiddishbookcenter.org/events.